Hi, and welcome back to a new episode of TLDR. For those tuning in for the first time, TLDR is short for Too Long Didn't Read, and we named our podcast that way because we want to save you the hassle of reading long research papers. Once a month, we talk to our researchers about their work in a way that even I, not being a cybersecurity researcher, can understand it. My name is Tobias Ebelshäuser from CISPA's Communication Department, and joining me today is one of our latest faculty hires, Wouter Lueks. Wouter joined us last December from EPFL in Switzerland, where he was already collaborating with Cas Kremers and other CISPA researchers on the development of the framework for most of Europe's COVID contact tracing apps. If you ask Wouter how he would describe his work very broadly, he will probably answer that he wants to find ways to make modern technical solutions to society's problems more privacy-friendly. Today, we're going to talk about why that is not always a very easy thing to do, and why some privacy problems may just lie in the solution itself. Hi Wouter, thanks for joining me today.
Hi, great to be here.
I hope you had a good start here at CISPA. You've met some CISPA researchers in your previous project, so I'm sure it was not too hard settling in here.
No, it was great. I've been really enjoying getting to know all the people working on interesting things and really figuring out new ways to collaborate with people.
All right. As I said before, you already collaborated with a few CISPA researchers when you worked on the COVID contact tracing apps. And I don't want to go into all too much detail talking about the development of these apps right now. However, I think it's a good example to talk about them because of the constraints you might encounter when making these solutions to society's problems, as I've said before, as privacy-friendly as possible. So can you maybe give me a short rundown of that process and what problems you and your colleagues encountered there?
Yes, absolutely. Right. So off the bat, right, first of all, I think it is important to realize how crazy this project was, right, where we worked with a lot of different people in a lot of different countries from many different disciplines. And personally, I hope it was sort of like a once in a lifetime event that we're not going to repeat.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
too often. And I think one of the things that was somewhat different in this project was really the timeline under which we had to do a lot of these things, right? It was sort of like weeks and maybe months versus that is not the normal academic timeline. But there were still a couple of very interesting aspects here, right? So here we really wanted to try to help with pandemic mitigation, to think about how can apps help with pandemic mitigation. And really the challenge here that comes back in a lot of my other work is how to do that using the things that you have available. Because, I mean, especially in 2020, right, during the COVID pandemic, all that we had to work with were the phones in people's pockets in order to do potentially some form of digital contact tracing. And there was really no other way to do this. And really, we had to work with whatever the mobile phone companies allowed us to do. And that type of constraints really forced us to have to invent new things and to be creative in many ways. And that is, I think, a true thread that comes up also in the more normal, slow-going aspects of my research, right? That are a little bit more on a human time scale of maybe half a year to maybe a little bit longer.
Because just to clarify, you couldn't just go out there and give everyone like a sort of a tracker or something.
Exactly, right? I mean, even apart from all the supply chains being shut down, right? That takes the time it takes to develop hardware and to roll out hardware really is completely infeasible, right? So we're stuck with whatever was already in people's phones, and we sort of had to repurpose that. But that is a thing that really pops up time and time again, right? Because really developing new hardware or saying, can you please carry a supercomputer around in your pocket really kind of doesn't work so well, right? So these constraints really have an effect on what type of technology you can deploy. And then in particular, when you want to design privacy-friendly solutions, typically the requirements are already a little bit higher than your normal run-of-the-mill, non-privately friendly implementation thereof. And that really makes it tough to do this well.
That's actually a good point, because I think especially in this case, you want to make this app as privacy friendly as possible, not even just not purely for ethical reasons, but only because if people think that these apps are not privacy friendly, they are not going to install them on their phones and not going to actively use them for a longer time.
Exactly, right. And I think this in particular, the COVID tracking thing, it was very clear that in order to for them to work well, more adoption would be better. And one way to drive more adoption would really be to guarantee that the privacy risks were minimized to the extent possible, right? And that sort of is another angle why I think it was important to do these things, not just because of all the reasons why developing privacy-friendly approaches, I think, is good in general, right? Is good in general for society to maintain privacy, but also in this case, purely from a sort of pragmatic point of view, that having better privacy leads to ideally better adoption.
Maybe in timescale-wise, you said that you had to work with what people have already in their pockets. And when it comes to like developing this idea, I can just imagine that the idea to use people's phones was an idea a lot of people had very quickly, but to actually go from there and invent or think of a privacy-friendly way to actually adopt that, I think that's a total different concept, right? So it must have taken way longer than just coming up with the idea to use technology to solve this problem.
Yes, and I think in general, right, when I'm working on how to solve a problem in a privacy-friendly manner, right, one of the first things you always have to do is to talk with people to figure out what is really the thing that you're trying to achieve. Not so much what is the particular technological mechanism through which you want to achieve this, but really what is your end goal? And this is not always easy. Right now, in this case, we had a lot of people available, right, and there was a lot of communication with our team as well as other teams, right, and using Bluetooth radio signals as a proxy for proximity came about relatively quickly. But then how to leverage that into a protocol and how to make that actually privacy friendly was much more difficult. Also to figure out what should you then do, right? What is the purpose, if you wish, of the system? Because once you know the purpose of the system, the goal that you want to achieve, you can then also think about how can I make that privacy friendly? Or put in another way, once you know what is the purpose of your system, you can try to construct your solution in a way that you can achieve this purpose and nothing else. And once you have achieved that, then you also immediately achieve all your privacy guarantees that you wanted to do. But this really is much easier to say than it is to realize. And it really requires thinking about, okay, what can go wrong? What should we protect? Do we really protect against that?
So do you think that in general, in society, when people try to solve these problems, I mean, you already mentioned this shortly, do you think that often people are too quick to just throw technology at the problem and not really think about what kind of risks or problems when it comes to privacy these solutions might entail?
I think there are a couple of things. Maybe I can try to untangle this a little bit, right? I think first of all, maybe as a society we're sometimes a little bit too trigger happy into assuming that technology will solve all our problems. So that is one, right? So the first step is, okay, maybe technology is not always the solution. Okay. Now, having said that, I'm a techie, so I do like to solve things, right? But to be fair, right, sometimes maybe one needs to come to the conclusion
that sometimes analog is better.
Analog, or maybe the problem's not even worth solving it because the risks that it would entail are actually too big, right? Okay. And that really brings me to the second thing that you're hinting at, that indeed quite often defining the problem to solve rather than the technical means through which you want to achieve this is a step that is sometimes kind of skipped or kind of implicit. So a lot of my work in the end ends up being teasing out what is the real purpose, the real thing that you're trying to solve. So going back to the COVID apps, right? The purpose is not to track people or to keep a log of who was close to whom, right? The purpose really was to be able to automatically notify people that have potentially been exposed to COVID so that they can take appropriate countermeasures, right? And that is very different than saying we need to log all these interactions between people or store all these interactions between people. And once you've sort of rephrased that into, okay, this is really the thing that I want to achieve, it then also becomes possible to think about privacy-friendly solutions. Yeah. And then the last thing that you were hinting at, right, is once you figure out a potential technological approach, really one needs to think about, or rather when you figure out your problem to solve, right, you need to think about what kind of risks does that then entail? Just solving the problem, does that already entail risks? And can we sort of support these risks? Is it okay to have this system in place knowing that there's some risks? And then one can think about, okay, now we're finally at the point, how do we solve this?
Yeah.
And then does the way in which we solve this then potentially bring extra risks, right? Because our solutions are not always perfect, however much I would like them to be.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. We've talked about this before, and so you said that if an app is privacy friendly, like in context of the COVID tracing apps, they are probably going to get a better adoption rate. And I think that might actually apply to your current project you're working on as well, because I think here privacy is also extremely important. It's a project you're doing in collaboration with the ICIJ, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, which was involved in big document leaks in the past, such as the Panama Papers. And there, I will let you explain it in a second better than I can, but the idea is to enable journalists to be able to anonymously share sensitive documents with each other to make collaboration on sensitive topics easier. So yeah, go ahead. Tell us a little bit about your current project.
So this is a project that really we started a couple of years back already, right? That was really, I would say, a more normal paced project compared to the things that we talked about before, where at some point we were contacted by the ICIJ saying, really, we are interested in enabling more collaborations between our investigative journalists that are part of our network. And here you see a very interesting design feature, if you wish, right, where journalists, as part of their investigations, really gather a lot of material, but that material is always sort of sensitive, right? Because it's always related to ongoing investigations, especially investigative journalists don't typically want to talk so much about what they're working on, nor do they always want to share all of the documents that they have collected. Sometimes they come from kind of public sources, but they might also not come from public sources, right? So they're reluctant to share, but at the same time, because the world is so globalized, we also know that a journalist in, let's say, the Netherlands might really benefit from collaborating with a journalist in Germany because somehow these investigations that they're sort of independently have been pursuing sort of intersect.
Yeah, I mean, as we've seen in all these document leaks, I've not gone on in too much depth on them, but these are like business networks that stretch over the whole globe. They're
exactly, because the world is global, so potential interesting, shall we say, things are also typically global.
Yeah.
And so the ICIJ contacted us saying, we're interested in supporting a search system where journalists can potentially figure out whether other journalists in their network are working on similar things. And then, because journalists have relatively high privacy requirements as far as their documents are concerned, right? They came to us in the group that I previously was part of at APFL, figuring out, okay, can you help us do this? And that led to a many-year collaboration that will hopefully soon lead to actual deployed software that journalists are using.
And how will this software work? So you hinted at that some journalists might have documents that other journalists are interested in. And how would they share it with each other? How do I, if I'm an investigative journalist in Germany, and I'm interested in something that, I don't know, I want to have information about an oil company, and someone in Dubai has some information that I would be interested in, but I don't know if that person has that information. How does your project idea solve that?
Okay. So let's start off by giving you a little bit of an overview of sort of the high level design, but also want to say something about how we got there, because that was also not completely obvious.
Okay.
So the way the system now works is that every individual journalist that has been onboarded into the system will add to their own computer the documents that they want to make available for search.
Okay.
So that is step one, and then other journalists that are also part of this network can input a search query that gets somehow distributed to all the other machines in the network. They will somehow answer this thing. And then locally, journalists will learn, there is somebody, not necessarily knowing where or who or anything else about this person, that matches this search query for this oil company, let's say Royal Dutch Shell, just to use an example.
Of course, there are other oil companies.
There are also other oil companies, right, that are not necessarily from the Netherlands. But anyway, right. And so this is step one, figuring out, is there potentially somebody with relevant information? And then step two is the way the system works is that it then enables these two journalists to have a conversation with each other to determine, is this do I potentially trust this other person on the other side of the line? Am I willing to share these documents or not? And then eventually that will roll over into something that is more, I would argue, traditional. Something where journalists really know very well how to interact with one another in a secure way once they have established this idea that they want to collaborate. So really the purpose really is enabling searching for documents when you don't know when somebody has these, and then doing the initial sensitive interaction between these journalists, figuring out, okay, do we really want to work together or not?
Okay, so your problem, because you said that it's important to figure out the problem beforehand. So your problem is there someone else who has information I want that might be willing to share it with other journalists?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And really just to give you an idea, right? Like, this took a while. It always takes a while, right? And like not just in this project, but in most projects, it takes a while in collaboration with partners, in this case, the ICIJ, right? To even just figure out, okay, what is the thing that we really want to solve? And what are the important things that we really need to do? And which are the kind of nice to haves, if you want, that we could potentially trade in order to get more privacy protection. And really this was a pretty interesting collaboration, really, with the ICIJ to narrow this down, to figure out also, right, this is something that you always do when you design privacy-friendly systems, is to figure out, who do we worry about? What do we want to protect?
Yeah.
And maybe that's a good point to start here, right? When you're thinking about journalists, they are both worried about the documents that they hold, because sometimes they come from sources that they don't want to reveal. They might also be related to sensitive ongoing research. And for both of these reasons, the documents are sensitive typically.
Yeah, sure.
At the same time, when I tell the whole world that I'm investigating this person that is involved with some shady business deals, again, that might be premature, right? Like that might be an ongoing research, and really at that point, as a journalist, I potentially don't yet want to reveal that, right?
So if you're broadcasting, I am looking for
exactly
this person X in relation to this company Y, then you are already saying that you might know something you shouldn't know.
Right? You might already set off some alarm bells, and then depending on how sensitive the investigation is, you might at that point not do that, right? When the piece comes out, sure, but before that, maybe not, right? And so both the documents, we wanted to build a system that protects the content of documents as well as what journalists are looking for.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that we had to figure out is who to protect this from, right? Which is also always a question that I think one needs to ask in cybersecurity, right? Who is your adversary, if you want, in sort of typical cybersecurity speak? And here, I mean, if you think about journalists, right, the potential adversaries are pretty broad, right? Like it can be a company.
Yeah, it can be government agencies.
But it can also be government agencies. It can be potentially a criminal organization of one form or the other, right? But these can be relatively powerful organizations.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure which leak this was related to, but if you've seen in Malta, there have been murders. There have been journalists who have been murdered because they were getting too close to something. And so these things happen, right? So these concerns, I would argue, are totally justified, right? Yeah. And this also made for an interesting interaction with the ICIJ to figure out, okay, how do we then build a system that offers good protection, or as good as we can get it, of
documents and the journalists that are interested in these.
So there's actually something on the line. There are stakes.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. Right. And so this is also, I think, interesting. We don't want to go into that probably too deeply, right? But it is also interesting from a point of view where one of the tendencies, I would argue, of people when thinking about privacy is to say, you know what, I've got nothing to hide. Yeah. Maybe that is true to some degree, but you can also realize, like, the moment you think about these journalists, right, they have things to hide. Yeah. And it really matters.
Yeah.
And so we should design systems that offer them good protection.
Yeah, okay. So it's basically a private or like a privacy-friendly search engine for sensitive documents.
Yes.
And how does this search query work? Like from a user perspective, do I install software on my computer and do I add documents there? And how are these queries handled?
Exactly, right? So, okay. So let me give you an overview of how this kind of works, and then we'll also see how it's kind of like surprising that it even works.
Okay.
So like a normal way potentially to solve this problem, if you don't really care about privacy per se, would be to say, we're going to use some kind of big company software, let's say Google or Amazon or whatever. We're going to upload all these documents there, and then we're going to use off-the-shelf search systems that will just, query these documents and figure out whether there's something interesting there. Mm-hmm. And that will work, and that would get you there, right? Like it's there's a little bit of engineering work, but that'll get you there. That will solve your problem. But it doesn't really offer any protections of the documents, right? But because we gave them to this one central party, right?
Yeah.
So what we did as a first sort of architectural decision while talking with ICIJ is that we decided we're going to leave a journalist's documents on their own computer. So every journalist has their own computer, be it a laptop or desktop or whatever, and the documents are going to be on this machine.
So it's not uploaded to a server.
It's not uploaded to the cloud. It's not uploaded to another server. And by what we then actually do is we sort of do construct a decentralized system. Like we make sure that these bits of interesting information, these documents that are interesting, are spread out over different machines, thereby making it much harder for a potential attacker to figure out, to get all of them at the same go, right? They might still be able to corrupt one of these machines, and there's not so much we can do about that. Mm-hmm. But there is no single point where you can go and get everything.
Like a very valuable server where you break in and have everything.
Exactly. Yeah. Right? Because that is, like, if you think about sort of state level adversaries, that is really not the situation where you want to be in. So in order to make this work, journalists will just install on their machine a piece of software. I wanted to say simple, but maybe it's not that simple. They will install a piece of software on their machine, and that piece of software will then ingest these documents. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. And then join a network of other journalists. So now we have a network of journalists that communicate, or essentially these pieces of software communicate with one another. So now when a journalist comes along, is like, I'm interested in this oil company or this specific person, they will enter on their own machine a search query. Stuff gets transmitted to all these other machines. They will process, they will send a reply back, and then this journalist will figure out, there is somebody here that has a relevant document, or nobody, and then you try again.
Okay, so I would just type in some keywords. So
you would type in keywords. Is like it's not completely the same as Google, but think about this as Google, right? You get a Google prompt, you type in your things, you maybe wait a little bit longer, you get your answers, right? And one of the reasons why you need to wait a little bit longer is because somebody might have their laptop closed because they're sleeping and they're on the other side of the world, right? So maybe you need to wait a day or something, but then you'll get your answers back and there are these three people that I should follow up with.
But there's a server in the middle handling these kind of queries?
Very well spotted, right? Because the way the internet works is that you can only communicate between machines that are actually online, right? And if somebody's laptop is closed, then that doesn't work, right? So for feasibility reasons, just in order to make this work, there is actually a server in the middle that handles that communication. Now we did...
Okay.
And we can come back to that later. We're actually not really trusting this server with anything. It just needs to be there in order to act as a post office, right? It cannot read anything, cannot learn anything, but it needs to be there in order to, hold the message for Tobias while Tobias is sleeping, and then so that tomorrow morning you can pick it up.
Which makes sense in a global world where global journalists should be able to communicate.
Exactly, right? Yeah. But it already, I mean, it already does differ a little bit from like your ye good old Google-like implementation, right? Where you would have everything right at your fingertips. But now to come back to, I tried to hint that this is kind of like counterintuitive, right? Because we figured out we want to protect queries. So nobody should be able to learn what somebody is searching for. Also, nobody should be able to learn what is the contents of documents or who has which documents. Yet, we want to build this system in such a way that we get answers, right? And then we can actually do something, right? And the thing that I forgot to say earlier, right? But if you're thinking about powerful adversaries, this in particular means that you cannot necessarily trust all these other machines in the network. Right? Even if the journalists are fantastic people, their machines might have been compromised, right?
Or someone might have been like added to that network undercover or something.
Potentially as well, right? Like so there are different reasons why you don't have a 100% guarantee that everybody in this network is trusted. Yeah. And that really makes it very difficult, right? Because now you need to send a query to a machine. It needs to process this query, send a response back that the query can actually do something with and figure out, they're interesting documents or not, without this other side learning what was being searched for.
So the bottom line is we have to talk to each other. I want to find out what you have, but I can't tell you what I'm looking for, and you can tell me what you have.
Exactly, right? And then, as is usual for, I would say, privacy-friendly solutions, then often the answer is, how do you do this? Well, we do this using the magic, quote unquote, of cryptography. So we use new cryptographic constructions to precisely do this. The querier is interested in documents containing some keywords. On the other side, there is a document that has many more keywords, and they run this cryptographic protocol and they want to figure out, or at least the querier wants to figure out, right, are these keywords in the document or not? And
so basically, there are two encrypted sets being compared, or is that too simplistic?
I mean, encrypted is not the right way, but we have a protocol, right? A protocol is just an interaction between two machines in this case that lets the querier figure out, is there a match or not, without revealing anything about the keywords that don't match. And what we actually use for this, if people that are listening and are familiar with some of the cryptographic protocols behind this, what we actually use is a version of a private set intersection protocol.
Okay.
And this intersection in this case is the intersection of query keywords versus document keywords.
So it's basically like a Venn diagram of keywords, and the one I searched for matched the ones that are in someone's document.
Exactly. And sort of zooming back out a little bit, what is interesting about this is that private set intersection protocols are not new. Right? Like somebody that has been doing anything crypto-y for the last, 10, 20 years will tell you, but Wouter, what gives, right? What is new about this? And this comes back to what we were talking about earlier. When you're thinking about this particular system setup, this particular scenario where you have a couple of hundred journalists that want to answer these questions, want to answer these search queries, practical constraints really start to matter. Because if you can do this protocol on a sort of one query, one document basis, scaling quickly starts to become a problem when every journalist has a couple of thousand documents and you have several hundred to 1,000 journalists, right? Because all of a sudden, like your one-time cost now becomes 1 million times as expensive. And then if you think about these just being somewhat not so recent laptops connected via internet connections that are maybe not as fast as we're used to in Germany, right? You really see how all kinds of new constraints pop into place where you now need to worry about how do we do this in a way that has low computational impact and has low communication cost. And really this is the thing that then this particular constraint really drives new research into, okay, but really we need protocols that work differently than what we have envisioned so far.
So the protocol that you now use in this project is optimized for, let's say, low computational cost, because you don't know what an activist that might be living in a, let's say, a country that is ridden by a civil war in the past 10 years, he or she might not have access to the latest hardware, and they also might not have access to a really fast internet connection. And so
exactly,
with your protocol, you made sure that it's a global democratic tool that everyone can use.
Exactly.
And now if I now ask you how you managed to do that, will that blow my mind, or might I be actually able to understand that?
I don't know. Let's try, right? I mean, it is a little bit tricky. So I think the best thought experiment to have in mind, right, would be to say, what would be a stupid way to answer this question?
Mm-hmm.
And a stupid protocol to answer this question would be, for example, to say, the document owner is just going to send all the keywords to the querier. And then the querier can locally figure out, my query keywords are in the documents keywords, so all good.
Mm-hmm.
So this works. Obviously, now the querier knows all the query keywords in the document, so that's not what you want.
Yeah.
So a slightly better way to do this, that already gets you relatively close to what is actually happening, is to instead say, before sending document keywords, the owner is going to apply a one-way function or a hash function that will essentially make all these keywords look random.
Mm-hmm.
We'll apply this one-way function to all these keywords and then send them over.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the querier can apply the same function to their query keywords and then compare. And it kind of like makes sense, right? You make them all look different, but okay, you can still do your comparison even though you applied this one-way transformation. Now, if you've been around in this space for a little bit longer, you realize, but just hashing or just applying this one-way transformation really is not good enough, because
if someone knows the function, they can just easily reverse it.
Not reverse, right? Because the one-way function thing tells you reversing is actually hard.
But they can try to use keywords and compare results.
Exactly, right? Because there are only so many keywords, right?
Yeah.
You're just brute force, right?
Yeah.
So it's very susceptible to a brute force attack.
Okay, yeah.
So there is one extra teeny tiny realization that one needs to make, is that rather than using a standard one-way function, one can use something that really looks like a one-way function, but has a key in there.
Okay.
And if you don't have the key, you cannot compute this function. And so this is how at least the instantiation that we use works, is that it is a, let's call it a keyed one-way function or pseudo-random function if you want to know the real term. And the server is going to do the same thing. So it generates a key, computes this one-way function on all the keywords in the documents, and sends them over. Now, this is cool because the querier doesn't have this key, right? They cannot do brute force anymore.
Yeah.
Except now it cannot compute this function
because it doesn't have the key.
because it doesn't have the key.
Yeah.
So now it turns out that there is a much smaller cryptographic building block that lets the querier and the document owner collaborate to compute this one-way function together, where the querier inputs the query keyword and the document owner inputs the key, and out comes the evaluation of this function.
Okay.
And so now we're still evaluating these one-way functions, right? But now because this key is involved, this brute force attack falls away. So it's still the idea of, okay, we're just going to evaluate one-way functions and then compare the output, right? So we're just going to hash essentially query keywords and document keywords. But because there is this key involved, you can no longer do the brute force attack.
And who has the key? Only the
document owner.
Okay.
And so the document owner kind of helps the querier evaluate this function on the query keywords. And then if you've been following along very carefully, right, you would realize now, okay, it's a little bit nasty, right? Because we don't want to reveal the query keywords to the document owner. So there's still a little bit of magic-y going on. But at least we stripped off one layer of magic.
Okay. Yeah. As I always say in this podcast, we always get to a point where the answer when I ask, and how do you do this, is math. And I think we're at this point right now.
Yes. So math or more math, right? Like, I think,
but it's very, very interesting that that all these constraints that you talk about, actually, you have to think of them. Otherwise, your tool is, I'm not saying it's worthless, but it's not as good as it can be, right?
Yes.
Because if only people from very developed countries with very good internet connections and fast computers can participate, I mean, you're missing out on a lot. If some bad stuff is going on in an underdeveloped country,
exactly,
people can't really take part in this.
Exactly, right? And so these things really matter, right? And they're actually so maybe this lets us bridge into another aspect to this, right? Is that you want this to be usable in a sort of very technical sense, in the sense that the machine should be powerful enough to actually do this stuff, right? Their internet connection should be powerful enough. This should be somehow fast enough that journalists get their answer, this week and not next year, because that would be problematic, right? Yeah. But then the other thing that we actually also looked into, because I personally believe that this is very important, right, is that when you deploy privacy-friendly technology, or you're thinking about deploying privacy-friendly technology, you want people to use this, right? Or at least I'm interested in solving practical problems, right? And one of the things that we did later and we're still working on, right, is actually to work with journalists to give them a, let's call it, simulation of this system, in order to figure out, can they actually work with this? And are they willing to, quote unquote, pay the price, right? I don't want to say that there is always a price that you have to pay when you go for a privacy-friendly design, because I don't believe that is fundamentally true. But if you take into account both the requirements for having a privacy-friendly and secure solution together with interesting operational constraints, you might end up in a position where you cannot get everything. Yeah. Right? You cannot be, potentially, in this case, you cannot be as expressive in terms of the things that you search for, right? And you can also not be as nice in the answers that you give back, right? Because maybe it would be very nice for the querying journalist to say, you know what? Here is the full document. Do you think it is interesting?
Yeah.
And this is useful, right? From a usability perspective, this is very good, right? Yeah. But then from a security privacy perspective, the document owner would be like, I don't think this is good, right? I don't want to always immediately return my document.
And so they wouldn't upload the document into the network?
And they wouldn't upload the document. And then we're back to what we talked about before, right? If you make it too non-privacy friendly, you might end up with a system that is not being used.
Yeah.
And so this is a fine line to walk, right? And what we did in this simulation study is really to work with journalists to figure out, can we explain this to them? Can we make them feel sort of the privacy risks that are in different potential configurations of such a system, and then figure out which kind of trade-offs they would make? And so far it seems that usually they're interested in the more privacy-friendly approaches that we have been working on, rather than the, let's say, more straightforward, but also therefore more leaky approaches.
Yeah. I think you already published a paper on the idea behind the project. And now you, as you said, you've worked on evaluating on how privacy preserving this software has to be. So where is this tool now at? Is it like going to release in 5 years, in next year? Or is that a bad question?
No. This is a great question, right? So we're doing a few things in parallel, right? And we have always been doing things in parallel, right? So the research paper. So I should have, maybe off the top of this conversation, right? Maybe we should have said that this is the data share system or the data share network system, and maybe we can put a link to the paper in the show notes, right? Yeah. So you can have a look at this, which is inspired by ICIJ's data share system that actually works on these centralized document leaks repositories, right? But then the version that we worked on was this decentralized search system. So we have been working with ICIJ both to do a lot of the user study work, right? To talk really with journalists and to interview them and to figure out. So that academic work is still in progress. But if you're interested, then drop me a note. And then in parallel, the last, let's say 2 years, we have been working with ICIJ developers to actually turn this into a usable system, right? And I think if you think about all the steps that you have to go through from sort of figuring out what the problem is to figuring out what are potentially privacy risks and how to reason about that and what you can mitigate and what you cannot, to then designing a system, right? You see that the system design we had in, summer of 2020, and rolling out the actual solution takes a little bit more time, right? Part of this was the usual pandemic constraints, but hopefully this year, I would hope.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Exactly.
It certainly sounds like something that can and will be really useful when it comes to investigations like this. Let's circle back maybe to something you said before, because when you talked about identifying the problems and using and solving them using technology, you hinted at that the solution itself might actually be a privacy risk. Talking before this recording, you already hinted at that this was the case in COVID tracing apps, and this might also be the case in using this document search software. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit on that, on how solving a problem itself will always or can always be a privacy risk?
Yeah. So what is first, maybe, I don't think this is a universally true thing. There might be systems where solving the problem does not actually entail new privacy risks, right? But I think the reason why figuring out which kind of risks are fundamental is important is that when you know that solving a particular problem will entail a risk, right, that then forces you to decide, do I want to pay this price or not? And if you don't want to pay this price, this means that you cannot solve this problem, which is a pain, right? But I also think that it is much more honest to say solving this problem will mean that you need to pay this price rather than sort of bullshit your way around it.
It's better to know beforehand.
Right? Exactly. And so, but now we have been talking a lot in the abstract, right? And so maybe the case of the document search system for journalists is the easiest way to show how a search system, right, that lets you answer, is there a journalist in the system with relevant documents, can already have leakage. Mm-hmm. And one of the leakage things that you might imagine is that there is this secret government project, right? Let's say it's called CISPA. And somebody, or maybe just somebody from the government, right, that has access to this system wants to know, has this been leaked? Mm-hmm. And because this is a document search system, right, all you need to do is input a search query, let's say CISPA, and what you will get out is there is somebody that has this document. And so there is no way that you can keep this secret, right? Yeah. Like having search functionality will force you to, right, for search to be useful, you need to give an answer.
Yeah.
Right? Otherwise, it's kind of pointless, right? You search for something which you never get an answer is not very useful. So, and the fact that you get an answer, right? The fact that you get an answer, yes or no, or there's somebody, or there's some multiple somebodies, can in and of itself already be leaky, right? And there's nothing... There's nothing you can do about it, right? Like it doesn't depend on how I built this system. It doesn't depend on the choices that I made in my specific cryptographic design, right? It's just the fact that I decide, okay, we're going to solve this problem that will entail, in this case, this leakage.
So if it's already a risk that somebody knows that something is out there, then you are not going to be able to solve it.
Exactly, right? Yeah. And this is fundamental. And I've, over the years, right, become much more convinced that it is very important to delineate things that are fundamental, that come from the problem that you're trying to solve, versus the things that come from the way in which you solve them.
Yeah.
And very often, right, like the way in which you solve them, and that I would argue is the case for many of the projects that I've been involved in, including the project with the ICIJ, as well as to some extent contact tracing, right? In order to satisfy deployment constraints, there might be teeny tiny bits of extra leakage that one needs to accept. Not necessarily needs to accept, right?
But you don't have to use it, right?
But something that as a designer or in collaboration with other people, you decide, okay, maybe this is acceptable.
Yeah.
Because that is what allows us to do it, because we don't know how else to do it.
Yeah. I mean, I think here again, the contact tracing app is a fairly well example for people that might actually be tangible, because if I have only met one person in the last 7 days and I get a notification that I have been in contact with a person that has COVID, well, there's only so much people who
exactly right. And maybe just to backtrack a little bit, right? To milk the contact tracing example for a few more minutes, right? One of the privacy risks that you might have in a contact tracing application, right, is that people learn who is positive.
Yeah.
And this is true, right? And this is indeed information that you don't want broadly out there. This can lead to stigmatization. This can lead to people being excluded. So this is not something that you want sort of generally to be very public. Now, at the same time, right, as you're just correctly explaining, right, if you build a system whose purpose is to notify you, Wouter, have been close to somebody with COVID, and I've only been close to one person in the last week, and I get a notification.
Yeah.
Guess what, right? I will learn at least that this one person is positive, right?
Yeah.
And so regardless of how you design the system, right, all the systems that were deployed in this phone inherently will have this particular weakness because there is no way around it. And it is important to know this, right? Because then one can make a decision.
If you know what you're dealing with, then that's your decision to make. But it's good to be aware.
Yes. And this is okay. The idea behind it that you're hinting at, right, is that you need to potentially have some understanding of how a system works, right? I don't think that is always necessarily true, right? I don't want to say that 80 million people in Germany need to understand how COVID apps work. I think that's bullshit, right? Like I don't think that's where we want to go, right? But then coming back to the journalists, right? There we're working with a much smaller target population, right? Where I actually do think it is important that they understand at least, not necessarily how it works, but that they can at least reason about potential risks well enough so that they can decide these documents.
Yeah, these are too sensitive.
These are too sensitive, right? And this is one of the other reasons why we did the simulation study, to really figure out how can we explain this to people, right? And maybe sneak preview of some of the things that seem to be coming out of this, right? Is that me explaining things, ironically, is not necessarily the best way to tell people about potential risks. And one of the things that seems to work a little bit better is to let people play around with a simulated system and see what is happening and see what is leaking. So this is one of the other reasons why we did that study.
Yeah. So what I can take away from this, in a sense, your research is focusing on real world societal problems that are here right now. You're doing foundational research on real world problems. Are there like any other interesting privacy related things you have your sights set on? Or
yes, absolutely, right. And just for the people that are now sort of like very confused how sort of real world problems lead to foundational research, right? The link is in what some of the things that we talked about before, right? That if you're trying to solve practical problems in the here and now, you will figure out constraints that existing solutions typically do not solve.
Yeah.
And that is how you get to new interesting research directions, like can we even do that? And it turns out that very often you can, right? And now to answer your real question, right, is yes, I'm always interested in sort of interesting real world challenges, like especially with an interesting societal angle, right? And recently I've become more interested in looking into other places where we're really deploying a lot of technology. Also, in many cases for good, right? It really brings a lot of good things, but then also in a way that people don't have a lot of agency to say no. Mm-hmm. So you might think about children in school or students at university, right? That really technology will help with them learn, but it might also bring risks. And I don't know if we fully understand these risks, right? And similar things happen when you think about, for example, elderly people, that we now use technology to potentially monitor them to make sure that they're okay.
Yeah.
But but I think your gut feeling is already like, okay, there are potential things that go wrong, right? And then the other thing that we've been working on quite intensively recently is more in the humanitarian aid sector, where, again, the same philosophy or belief is that technology will make a huge difference. And very often, I think it does, but it also brings a lot of risks. And in particular, in the humanitarian sector, we're dealing with people that have potentially very little agency, right? If the choice is between, do you want to use this technology and get food, or
do you want to, like, maybe,
or you want you and your family not to have food, then that is not necessarily a situation in which people have a lot of agency.
Yeah, that's true.
And so I'm very interested in thinking about solving this type of societal problems in the right way, let's say.
So if any of our listeners are right now thinking, okay, I might have an idea that sounds like Wouter could actually tackle, drop him a note. We'll have his email address in our show notes. So,
by all means.
Wouter, thank you very much. I'm really excited to have been talking to you, because I'm not sure we have tackled this many societal real world problems before in our podcast episode. So thank you very much for that. To get back on the cybersecurity track a little bit. I mean, everything is about cybersecurity, but I have some quick questions for you that we usually ask all of our podcast guests. So, and I don't want to exclude you here. So, Wouter, do you use a password manager?
Yes. I started doing this a couple of years ago, and I've never been happier.
Yeah?
Yes.
So is there a particular reason why you entrust your passwords to this tool?
I mean, in my particular case, right, I did do my due diligence and figured out how this particular one worked. And I sort of convinced myself that is about as good as I can do another thing, right? But I think here there is also even if that security level were slightly lower, like I think it is actually very high, right? But even if it were a little bit lower, I think one should still seriously think about using that, because if the baseline that you compare against is using the same password all over the place, right? Like, so don't do that, okay? Don't use the same password all over.
We have it on tape here. Second question: have you ever fallen for a phishing email?
I don't think so, but I will also honestly admit that I probably could fall for that.
Okay.
And actually, like, thinking about sort of current affairs, I am very worried when phishing emails start being crafted by ChatGPT.
Yeah,
and friends.
I've heard about
I don't
this.
know. Like, this is not my area of research, but I have been thinking about it, and I don't know. I mean,
if natural language generators get better, we will.
I mean, there are a couple of checks that I do, right, and very often I have been lucky, right. I get an email from whatever, a bank that is not my bank, right, and then I realize. But so like I said, so far they have been, I think, most of the time bad enough that I caught it, but
I think it will get harder.
It will get. I'm afraid it will get harder, and
especially for non-techie people.
Yes.
Yes. We might have to talk to one own expert about that. Yeah. Let's drop it in the next episode's notes. As a cybersecurity researcher, do you handle your private data differently than, I don't know, a non-techie would? So are you like very wary of social media and sharing your private data?
Yes, I think so, right? There are a couple of things that I do that maybe other people don't. One is that I don't have Facebook, for example. I'm also a little bit more reluctant, I think, or at least more conscious about what I share publicly. And then I think, but this is maybe more me being a techie necessarily than me being a privacy researcher, right? But I also think more carefully about where I have my data and who has access to this data.
Yeah, okay.
So I don't necessarily have everything centralized.
Okay. So not a central cloud server, or what do you mean exactly?
I mean, I do I do have some things in the cloud, but I'm sort of conscious about which things I have in the cloud. And these are typically not the super sensitive things. And the things that do go into the cloud are usually then encrypted into the cloud. Okay. But I'm also sort of like, and like at the same time, right, I'm also feeling the pain, quote unquote, of making some of these choices. So it's also good for sort of my research to sort of realize, right?
So again, privacy has a price.
I mean, it doesn't always come for free. I mean, it's always my goal to make things as easy as possible, but it's not always.
Yeah, sure.
Unfortunately, not always the case.
Okay. What do you think about smart homes?
Blindsiding me. So this is actually interesting, right? Because I maybe this is the techie in me, I don't know, right? But I really like the idea of a smart home. And then I'm looking at a lot of these solutions that are essentially uploading all of these data into the cloud, and that I'm not comfy with.
Yeah.
Like that is in particular, thanks for actually reminding me, right? That is actually an area where I have been looking into some alternatives that let me host that myself, or at least locally, so that I don't need to, be like, because I don't think that is actually necessary, even though I see how that makes some things easier, right? But a few months back, I was looking into security cameras for whatever reason, because I look into random things. And it turns out that a lot of these are actually just streaming video into the cloud. And I understand why, right? From a technical point, I understand why that is the case. Also makes me very uncomfy.
Yeah.
So I haven't bought them yet.
I mean, we've had quite some scandals. If you look into it, there's a few companies that will probably come up on Amazon if you look for them, and they have been quite some scandals when it comes to.
To be honest, I haven't looked into the scandals yet, but just from a sort of technical point of view, I was like, I don't know.
I mean, the idea behind it is scary.
This worries the heck out of me. Yeah.
So last question, and then you're done with being blindsided. How do you feel about cryptocurrencies?
I don't own any cryptocurrencies. I'm somehow regretting this sometimes. I think there are some ideas behind cryptocurrencies that are interesting. At the same time, especially the last 1 to 2 years, we have been riding a hype wave that I think is very unhealthy. And that actually, in particular, made a lot of people lose a lot of money. And I'm not particularly comfy with that. But I do think there are some, as an thought experiment, I think there are interesting ideas there. The way it has been intertwined with a lot of things,
not so much.
Potentially difficult.
Okay. Then that was it for this episode. Thank you very much, Wouter, for joining us here. I've had a lot of fun, and I feel like I've learned a lot of things. So thank you very much. And I hope you'll continue to make society better with your research.
Thanks so much for the invite. It was a great pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.